Hi everybody, today I'm going to be talking about logging in Tongass National Forest. So first some background, Tongass National Forest is the largest national forest in the United States, and it's located in Alaska, and it covers several island communities as well as the mainland. It's not all connected to itself. It was first established as a national forest in 1907 by the executive order of President Theodore Roosevelt. It's been a roadless area since the creation of the roadless rule in 2001 by the order of President Clinton. It's a temperate rainforest, and that means it's a carbon sink, it's a lot of natural habitat, and there are extremely large old growth trees there. Because of those extremely large old growth trees, there's a lot of logging interest in the area. Old growth is much more valuable wood than new growth because it is not only quite a bit larger and useful for more different varieties of tasks, it's also stronger and it's got a better grain than new growth wood. There's old growth and new growth in Tongass, but most of it's old. Logging companies make quite a bit of money exporting this lumber, especially this one Viking lumber company, which has the last medium to large sized sawmill in southeast Alaska. And a lot has been made of the fact that if Tongass is closed to logging, this lumber company might have to close as well, and how that will affect the Alaskan economy. A lot of the legal controversy surrounds this man, Mike Dunleavy, the governor of Alaska. A lot of the elected politicians, including this man in Alaska, favor the logging industry, but locals in Alaska generally don't favor logging as a means to make a living when the um, government agencies have at various times considered removing the roadless rule on Tongass. 96% of the public comments have been in favor of keeping the roadless rule in place. Less than 1% have favored a complete removal, and everyone else has favored a partial removal. The Trump administration, though, favored industry and cutting what they saw as red tape or environmental protections surrounding prevention of industry and extraction of natural resources. The Trump administration spoke with Alaskan politicians and then instructed the USDA and the Forest Service to reconsider the roadless rule for Tongass National Forest. Following that discussion, the roadless rule was eliminated entirely for Tongass, and that meant 165,000 acres of old growth were open for logging, and 20,000 acres of younger growth were open for logging. Now, this sparked a lot of legal controversy, especially people thinking the agency decision was arbitrary and capricious. And under the APA, if an agency decision is arbitrary and capricious, it must be reversed and the previous state of affairs will be reinstated. But that's a pretty hard standard to meet, and the courts are usually pretty deferential to agency decisions. Still, in this case, it seems pretty clear cut that the decision wasn't made responsibly. So, local logging areas have been known to engage in timber fraud in Tongass, and that means a variety of things. One of them is export violations, where lumber was exported improperly, it wasn't recorded well, taxes weren't paid on it, various violations in shipping the lumber over to Asia. The lumber companies are also known to ignore the designated sales areas, taking as much lumber as they see fit around the sales areas, or taking an adjacent site with better lumber instead of the site that has been okayed for its environmental impact. And part of the reason that these companies can get away with this is the areas are so remote and hard to police, and there's very little inspection, practically no inspection of this logging activity. It's all self-reported. So the lumber company can lie without many implications. And they have a pretty strong economic interest in doing this. So the picture on the left with the caption written across it says, in 2018, timber thieves stole approximately $317,000 in trust land timber. And that was prepared as a part of a presentation by Washington State And they weren't speaking about people with lumber permits, they were speaking about effectively poachers and them alone coming in and taking lumber unauthorized. And that number might be much higher if they also considered violations by people holding a permit on federal lands. So, all of that timber fraud is a good indication that people aren't logging responsibly and leans towards not opening more of Tongass for logging. But there are also scientific reasons to keep the roadless protections in place. And one of those, especially during the climate crisis, is the huge carbon sink that the national forest is. There are some estimates that are as low as 30%, some as high as 45%, but about 40% of the carbon stored in US national forests is stored in the Tongass National Forest. It's got a huge ecosystem value. It's one of only 4 old growth temperate rainforests left intact in the world. There's lots in this ecosystem that you can find hardly anywhere else, basically only 3 other places worldwide. And it also helps prevent landslides to have this much security in the soil. The amount of biodiversity here is really boggling and it holds a lot in place. And in Alaska, especially in these island communities, a lot of times the towns and villages are built into valleys, and especially valleys right on the water. So if you strip a hillside bare with the constant rain that a temperate rainforest needs, there'll be a lot more landslides that just push these towns right into the ocean. It also arguably has endangered species value, and it doesn't have the kind of value that's actionable under the ESA. The species that live here generally are not yet endangered or threatened, but a lot of them are struggling, especially species of salmon that are losing their habitat elsewhere. And part of the reason these species are still flourishing, well, even the Forest Service admits they've become scarce in other parts of the United States, is because they have all of these millions of acres of untouched natural habitat to sustain them. So even though this isn't legally actionable, there can be a pretty solid argument made that the forest is helping prevent some of these struggling animals from becoming endangered. Finally, on top of the timber fraud and the scientific considerations, public opinion and local economy don't favor opening up the area to logging either. Historically, a lot of people did have to rely on the logging industry to sustain themselves, but currently, many people have been able to make a living off of fishing and tourism. And those two economic drivers both depend on the forest continuing to exist here for these people. The forest ecosystem helps to maintain fish populations that are failing other places, especially salmon. And tourists aren't going to want to come and tour an area that is just a stripped bare hillside. They want these big natural expanses to draw them to Alaska. Most of the public, as I mentioned before, don't want logging in the forest. 96% of people opposed the decision to remove the roadless rule. They didn't even want a few exemptions of the roadless rule, they wanted it to stay intact. There are also Indigenous culture considerations. So, a lot of Indigenous culture in the area is based around the animals and the fish in the forest, and also materials of the forest itself. Cedar features pretty prominently in a lot of Indigenous culture, and that's part of the tree itself that makes up the forest. So, this is not a present court case, but it does give some promising precedent. In 2003, remember that the roadless rule was instated in 2001, and a lot of people weren't too happy about it. So in 2003, the Forest Service made a decision to remove the roadless rule for at least parts of Tongass National Forest. The USDA used the same environmental impact statement as it had in 2001 to establish the roadless rule, and all of a sudden, using that same environmental impact statement, decided to make the opposite decision, decided that all those factors were in favor of removing the rule. And the court found that that was a violation of the Administrative Procedure Act and was arbitrary and capricious because there wasn't a careful reasoning for the decision, because it seemed like the organization had taken all of the facts and just made the decision it wanted to make without reasoning why it got there. And this is a more egregious example than what happened after the Trump administration came into office. There was a new EIS and a new consideration of the facts. But again, it seems like most of the public comments, the scientific evidence, everything was taken into account and just ignored, and the area was opened up for logging anyway. And since the courts have reached the decision to protect this same forest on this same issue before, it's promising precedent for if this happens again. And I say again because when the Biden administration came into office, they reversed the Trump administration rollbacks on environmental protections, not just here, but around the country. And that paused the controversy pending the next election. So there's no promise that the Trump administration won't come back into office and open up the forest again. And unfortunately, even if this continues to be a back and forth, if every 4 years there's logging and then the next 4 years there isn't, that's just going to pick away at the forest until it's all the way gone. And much of the forest was already damaged during the Trump administration. And it takes 800 years or more for this forest to restore itself. And I just wanted to show some pictures of these clear cut areas because it's easy to think the forest is so huge that none of this will make a difference. But you can see these huge bald patches in the forest from helicopters, from planes, from aerial views, and it's not a minor issue. It's this huge decimation of acres and acres of land. And then here are my sources.